You are sitting somewhere right now watching this. Maybe you're on a couch, maybe in bed, maybe on a train with your phone tilted just so. Take a second and actually notice the room, or the seat, or the space around you, not as a background you've stopped paying attention to, but as something present, immediate, undeniably there. Notice the weight of your own body against whatever's supporting it. Notice the temperature of the air. Notice that somewhere behind all of this noticing, there's a quiet, automatic assumption running underneath everything, that all of it is simply, obviously real, and that this question doesn't even need to be asked. You believe the couch is really beneath you. You believe the room around you is really there. You believe you woke up this morning, ate something, said something to someone, and that all of it happened in a world that exists independently of your believing it. Prove it. Not give me a reason to think it's probably true. Not show me the evidence. Prove it the way you'd prove a mathematical theorem, the way there's no conceivable way it could be otherwise. Prove with total certainty that the room around you is real, that your hands are real, that the last 5 minutes actually happen. You can't. Not really. And the strange thing is that almost nobody ever notices this because the feeling of certainty and the fact of certainty get so tangled together in ordinary life that we stop being able to tell them apart. You feel sure the floor is there. You feel sure you're awake. You feel sure that the person you talked to yesterday exists independently of your memory of them. But feeling sure and being able to prove it beyond any possible doubt are not the same thing, and almost 400 years ago, one man decided to find out just how far that gap really went. He did something almost nobody has done before or since. He sat alone, deliberately, and tried to destroy every belief he had. Not because he thought the world wasn't real, not because he'd lost his mind, but because he wanted to know if there was anything, a single thing, that could survive total, merciless doubt. He wanted a floor beneath the floor, a foundation so solid that no argument, no illusion, no deception, however powerful, could ever knock it down. His name was René Descartes, and what he found down there at the bottom of his own doubt would end up reshaping science, philosophy, and eventually, 3.5 centuries later, the exact questions we now ask about simulations, artificial minds, and whether the world in front of you is the one you think it is. This is the story of what happens when a man decides to doubt everything. Before you go any further, it's worth understanding what kind of man was capable of even attempting this, because the experiment only makes sense once you understand how much he had to lose by running it. Descartes was not a rebellious outsider sniping at institutions he'd never been part of. He was educated at one of the most rigorous Jesuit colleges in France, trained for years in scholastic philosophy, logic, mathematics, and theology, absorbing an entire inherited picture of the universe before he ever thought to question it. He went on to study law, to travel through Europe, to spend time in military service, watching the world through the eyes of a soldier as much as a scholar. And at some point in his life, restless, unsatisfied, aware that the education he'd received had filled his head with opinions he had never personally tested, he withdrew. He eventually settled in the Dutch Republic, a place that offered him something increasingly rare in Europe at the time: relative intellectual freedom and enough solitude to think without interruption. It was there, isolated by his own choice, that he began the work that would eventually become the Meditations on First Philosophy, a text structured, quite deliberately, not as a lecture but as a first-person diary of destruction and discovery, written across 6 days, as though the reader were sitting beside him while he tore his own mind apart in real time. That structure matters. Descartes didn't write a list of arguments for you to memorize. He wrote an experience for you to live through, which means the only honest way to understand what he found is to actually do what he did, not read about doubt but feel it. Let's start where he started. Not with his biography. Not yet. Start with the feeling itself, the ordinary, unexamined confidence you have in the world around you right now. Think about your hands. You've seen them thousands of times. You know their shape, their lines, the small scar or freckle you could describe with your eyes closed. If someone asked you, "Are you sure you have hands?" you would look at them almost with irritation. Of course. What kind of question is that? That confidence is the starting point because Descartes had exactly the same confidence and he decided to attack it anyway. Not because he doubted he had hands in any ordinary sense. He wasn't losing his grip on reality. He was doing something much stranger and much more deliberate. He was asking, what is the most secure thing I can possibly know, and how would I find it if I refused to accept anything on the strength of habit, tradition, or the mere feeling of obviousness? To understand why he did this, you have to picture the world he was writing in. Descartes lived in the first half of the 17th century, at a moment when the old certainties of the medieval world were cracking. Ancient authorities that had gone unquestioned for 1,000 years were being challenged by new astronomy, new physics, new ways of looking at nature that didn't care what Aristotle had said centuries before. Descartes himself had been trained in that older tradition, stuffed full of inherited opinions from childhood, and at a certain point in his life he stopped and asked a question that should sound familiar to anyone who has ever felt the ground shift under a belief they'd held their whole life. How much of what I know did I actually verify myself, and how much did I simply absorb because everyone around me treated it as obvious? Once he asked that question honestly, he couldn't unask it. He realized that if even a few of his foundational beliefs turned out to be false, everything built on top of them, every deduction, every piece of reasoning that assumed those foundations would be unreliable too. It's the same problem you'd have with a building. If the foundation has a hairline crack, you don't necessarily see it in the rooms upstairs. Everything looks fine, wallpapered and lived in. But the crack is still there, quietly undermining everything above it. There's a particular kind of vertigo that comes from noticing this in your own life, not just Descartes'. Think of a belief you absorbed as a child about your family, your country, the way the world works, that you never actually examined until, for whatever reason, life forced you to. Maybe it was a piece of advice repeated so often it felt like fact. Maybe it was an assumption about how people like you were supposed to live. At some point you looked at it directly for the first time and realized you had never actually checked whether it was true. You had simply never had a reason to doubt it, and the absence of a reason to doubt something is not the same as evidence that it's correct. That small, private vertigo, the moment you realize a belief you've lived inside for years was never actually tested, is the emotional seed of everything Descartes is about to do, except he doesn't stop at one belief. He turns that same question on every belief he has, all at once, including the most basic ones, that a physical world surrounds him, that his body belongs to him, that the objects in front of him are exactly what they appear to be. So Descartes made a decision that most people never make because it is genuinely uncomfortable to make it. He decided not to trust any of his beliefs merely because they felt obvious. He decided to withhold his assent from anything that could, even in principle, be doubted, not because he thought all his beliefs were false, but because he wanted to find out which ones, if any, were truly indestructible. If he could locate even one belief that could not be doubted under any circumstances, he would have his foundation. Everything else could then be rebuilt on top of it, brick by brick, with actual justification instead of inherited assumption. Picture, for a moment, what it would actually feel like to try this yourself, seriously, not as a thought exercise you skim past, but as something you actually attempt. You'd start with something small, maybe the belief that the object across the room is a lamp. Easy enough to doubt in the abstract. You could be misremembering what it's called, misjudging the shape in dim light. Then you'd move to something larger, the belief that the room has 4 walls, that it hasn't rearranged itself since you last checked. Then larger still, the belief that you have a body at all, extended in space, with a location, weight, a front and back. And notice as the scale of what you're doubting increases, how much harder it becomes to hold the doubt seriously, how strong the pull is to simply stop, to let the doubt collapse back into ordinary confidence, because sustained doubt at this scale is genuinely uncomfortable in a way that idle skepticism about a single small fact never is. Descartes felt this pull too, and wrote about it candidly. The difficulty wasn't intellectual, constructing the arguments. It was psychological, sustaining the doubt against the powerful, almost gravitational pull of habitual belief, which kept trying to reassert itself the moment his attention wandered. He describes something close to an effort of will required to keep the old, comfortable opinions from creeping back in uninvited, noting that long-standing habits of belief are not dislodged by a single afternoon of argument. They have to be actively, repeatedly resisted, the way a swimmer has to keep working against a current that never actually stops pulling in the other direction. This is worth knowing, because it means the discomfort you might be feeling right now sitting with these ideas isn't a sign you're doing the exercise wrong. It's the exercise. The tension between what you know intellectually you cannot prove and what you cannot help feeling anyway is not a bug in this thought experiment. It is the entire experience Descartes is trying to give you. This project is worth pausing on because it's easy to hear doubt everything and picture some kind of dramatic breakdown, a man refusing to believe his own name. That's not what was happening. Descartes wasn't claiming that his ordinary beliefs were false. He was running an experiment, a deliberate and temporary one, in which he treated anything doubtful as if it were false, purely for the purpose of seeing what, if anything, remained standing. Philosophers later gave this experiment a name, methodological doubt, to distinguish it from someone who has simply lost the ability to trust the senses. Descartes wasn't sick. He was doing something much rarer. He was voluntarily, deliberately, systematically dismantling his own mind to see what its foundations were actually made of. There's also a practical problem buried in this project that Descartes himself acknowledges. You cannot actually examine every single belief you hold, one at a time, across an entire lifetime of accumulated opinion. There are simply too many, and life is too short. So instead of interrogating each individual belief, is this true, is that true, is this other thing true, he adopts a more efficient strategy. He goes after foundations instead of bricks. If he can identify the general sources his beliefs come from, the broad categories of evidence he's relied on his whole life, and show that even one of those sources is capable of producing falsehood without warning, then every belief that traces back to that source becomes suspect all at once without needing to be checked individually. Undermine the foundation, and you don't need to inspect every brick in the wall above it. The whole wall is now in question. And where do you start an experiment like that? You start with the most obvious source of belief you have: your senses. Think about how much of what you believe comes from your eyes, your ears, your hands. You believe there's a chair in the room because you see it. You believe water is cold because you feel it. Your senses are, in a sense, the front door through which almost everything you know about the external world enters your mind. If that front door can't be trusted, everything that comes through it is suspect. And here's the uncomfortable truth Descartes forced himself to sit with: your senses have deceived you before. Not hypothetically, actually. You've seen a straight stick appear bent the moment it enters water. You've seen a distant tower look round from far away and discovered, up close, that it's actually square. You've misjudged a shadow for a shape in the dark, felt your heart jump, and then realized it was only a coat on a chair. These aren't exotic thought experiments. They're mundane facts about how perception works. Your senses are not a perfect window onto reality. They're an interpretive system, one that can be fooled by distance, by lighting, by the angle of a lens made of water or air. There's a specific move worth pausing on here, because it's the same move Descartes makes explicitly, and it's easy to rush past without noticing how carefully reasoned it actually is. He doesn't argue my senses have failed me before, therefore I should distrust them always about everything. That would be a sloppy overgeneralization, and he knew it. What he argues instead is narrower and much harder to escape. Prudence itself requires that you never place full trust in something that has deceived you even once, because you can no longer be certain in advance which future instances will turn out to be reliable and which won't. A source that lies to you occasionally isn't a source you can selectively trust, not without some independent way of telling in the moment which reports are the trustworthy ones, and the senses themselves offer no such warning label. The bent stick doesn't announce itself as an illusion while it's happening. It looks exactly as convincingly bent as a genuinely bent object would look. This is the seed of everything that follows, not a claim that the senses are useless, but a claim that their occasional, undetectable failures are enough to disqualify them as a source of absolute certainty, even if they remain perfectly good enough for ordinary life. There are other examples worth sitting with too, because the more of them you collect, the harder it becomes to dismiss the pattern as a handful of unlucky coincidences. Look at a mirage shimmering above hot asphalt on a summer road. Your eyes report standing water where there is, and never was, any water at all, and the report is convincing enough that drivers genuinely brake for it. Listen to a ventriloquist throw their voice, and notice how confidently your ears locate the sound coming from the wrong source, even though you know, intellectually, exactly where the real voice is coming from. Recall the last time you woke from a nap disoriented, momentarily unsure what room you were in, what time of day it was, or even, for a strange half-second, who you were, a small, mundane gap in which your sense of reality had to be rebuilt almost from scratch before it snapped back into place. None of these are exotic. They're the ordinary texture of having a nervous system that interprets rather than simply records. And once you've collected enough of them, a quieter, more uncomfortable question starts to form: if the system is capable of being wrong this often, in this many different ways, on what basis do you trust it completely the rest of the time? Now, this alone doesn't destroy much. Descartes himself acknowledges that these are edge cases, distant objects, unusual conditions. It would be a strange kind of paranoia to conclude, from the bent stick illusion, that you can never trust your eyes about anything, including the walls immediately around you, the paper right under your hand. And Descartes actually raises this objection to himself. If the senses fail only under unusual conditions, why not just trust them under ordinary conditions, right here, right now, close up, in good light? Isn't it a kind of madness to doubt that you're sitting by the fire, in your dressing gown, holding a piece of paper in your hands? And it's worth pausing on how reasonable that objection actually is, because Descartes doesn't dismiss it. He takes it seriously enough to need a genuinely stronger reason to keep doubting. If all he had were bent sticks and distant towers, the whole project would stall out right here, and rightly so. Nobody needs to doubt the existence of their own hands, because occasionally, at a distance, in bad light, people mistake one object for another. The skeptical challenge has to earn the right to go further, and it does, not by finding more examples of sensory error, but by finding a single scenario that threatens even the closest, clearest, most immediate perceptions you have. Not the tower far away, the paper in your hands, right now, close enough to touch. This is where the real machinery of the argument begins to turn, because Descartes doesn't stop at senses can be tricked at a distance. He goes further, into a question that sounds almost too simple to matter, and turns out to be devastating. He asks, how do you know you're not dreaming right now? Sit with that question for a second, because it's not a throwaway line, it's the hinge on which the entire second act of this story turns. Think back to the most vivid dream you've ever had. Not a hazy, half-remembered one, the kind that felt completely, totally real while it was happening. Maybe you were in a familiar room, talking to someone you know, doing something as mundane as making coffee or driving to work. In the dream, nothing felt strange. The floor held your weight. The light looked like light. Your own thoughts felt like your own thoughts. You didn't pause halfway through the dream and think, this seems suspiciously vivid, I should check if I'm dreaming. You just lived it, the same unreflective way you're living this exact moment right now. And then you woke up, and in that instant of waking, the entire world you'd just been inhabiting, every object, every conversation, every sensation of weight and temperature and sound evaporated as though it had never been real at all. Not because it was low quality. While it was happening, it was, for all practical purposes, indistinguishable from waking life. The dream world didn't announce itself as fake. It felt exactly the way this moment feels to you right now. This is the uncomfortable engine of Descartes' dream argument, and it's worth being precise about what it actually claims because people often misremember it as something dumber than it is. Descartes is not saying you are definitely dreaming right now. He's asking something narrower and, in a way, more disturbing. What feature of your current experience could you point to that would prove with certainty that this is not a dream? Because whatever feature you pick, vividness, coherence, the feeling of continuity, the presence of your own body, dreams have all of those too, at least while you're inside them. There is no internal marker, no built-in stamp of authenticity that waking experience carries and dreaming experience lacks. The two states can feel identical from the inside. The only way you ever know a dream was a dream is retrospectively, after waking up into something that then, by comparison, seems more real, but that more real feeling is exactly the feeling you're having right now, and it was exactly the feeling you had inside the dream too. Once you actually let this land, it's genuinely disorienting, and it's supposed to be. Because it means the usual criteria you'd reach for this feels too detailed to be a dream. I remember what I did this morning. Dreams don't have that kind of continuity, don't actually settle anything. Dreams can be astonishingly detailed. They can include entire fabricated histories that feel, in the moment, like real memories stretching back further than the dream itself. Descartes isn't asking you to believe you're literally dreaming. He's asking you to notice that you don't currently possess a method for ruling it out. And a belief you can't rule out an alternative to is not a belief you can call certain. Push on this a little further, because the temptation at this point is to reach for some clever workaround, and it's worth watching each one collapse. Maybe you'd say, I can pinch myself. Pain feels different from imagined pain, and if it hurts, I must be awake. But people report pain inside dreams all the time, stubbed toes, falls, injuries that hurt exactly the way waking injuries hurt, right up until they wake up and the sensation vanishes with the rest of the scene. Maybe you'd say, I can check the time, or try to read text since dream logic famously distorts clocks and words. That's a genuinely clever move, and modern lucid dreaming practitioners actually use techniques close to this. But notice what it actually proves. At best, a reality check like that can sometimes reveal you're dreaming after the fact from inside a lucky moment of suspicion. It cannot give you a standing guarantee, checkable at any instant, that you are awake right now, this second, without having just performed the test, and even the test itself, and your judgment of its result, is happening inside whichever state you're currently in. If you're dreaming and dream that the clock read correctly, you'll believe you passed the test. The tool you'd use to escape the problem is itself a tool operating from inside the problem. Let that sit for a moment, because this is where the video wants you to actually feel it rather than just intellectually register it. Look around you right now. The room, the device you're holding, the light source nearby, whether it's a window or a lamp. Every one of those things feels utterly, undeniably present. And yet, somewhere in your memory, there's a dream you had that felt exactly this present, exactly this undeniable, right up until the moment you woke up and it was gone. Nothing about the feeling of this is real was different between that dream and this moment. The feeling is not evidence. The feeling is just the feeling. There's a version of this that gets even stranger the longer you sit with it. Consider that inside a dream, you don't just misjudge a few details, you can construct an entire fabricated past in an instant. You can dream that you've lived somewhere for years, that you have a history with a person you've never actually met, that events happened last week which never happened at all, and none of it feels invented while you're inside it. It feels remembered. This means the dream argument isn't only a threat to your perception of the present room, it's a threat to the reliability of memory itself, because a sufficiently convincing dream doesn't just simulate a moment, it can simulate the feeling of a past leading up to that moment. If a dream can manufacture the sensation of remembering a childhood that never occurred, then the mere feeling of remembering something is not, by itself, proof that it happened. That's a much larger claim than maybe this exact room is a dream. It's closer to nothing about the felt quality of a memory, however detailed, however emotionally rich, however continuous it seems with everything before it, can be used as proof of its own accuracy. There's a phenomenon worth mentioning here that Descartes never knew about, but which makes his argument feel even sharper today than it did in his own time, what sleep researchers now call the false awakening. It's a specific, well-documented experience in which a person dreams that they have woken up, dreams the exact texture of getting out of bed, walking to the bathroom, checking the time, sometimes even dreaming that they're recalling the dream they just had, all of it embedded inside a further layer of dreaming, with no felt seam between the waking up and the dream that follows it. Some people report this happening in stacked layers, waking up inside a waking up inside a waking up, each layer feeling exactly as convincingly real as the one before it, until an actual, physical awakening finally breaks the sequence. If a mind can construct not just a convincing world, but a convincing experience of escaping that world into a realer one, an experience that itself turns out to be false, then the naive strategy of "I'll know I'm awake because it will feel different from the dream" doesn't just fail once. It can fail recursively, layer after layer, with each false escape feeling exactly as certain as a genuine one. There's a scientific footnote worth adding here, because it deepens the dream argument without requiring anything speculative. Sleep researchers have found that a significant portion of an ordinary night is spent in the sleep stage most associated with vivid, narrative dreaming, and that within that stage, the brain's activity in several respects resembles waking activity far more closely than it resembles deep, dreamless sleep, active, engaged, processing something that, from the inside, is presented as a continuous world with sensory richness, spatial coherence, and emotional stakes. This is part of why dreams can feel so total while they are happening. The machinery producing the experience is, in important ways, running in a mode close to the machinery that produces waking experience, rather than simply running dark. And there's a further detail worth knowing, because it complicates the easy assumption that surely you'd notice something was off if you looked closely enough. A small percentage of people train themselves, through deliberate practice, to become aware they are dreaming while the dream is still happening, a state researchers call lucid dreaming. What's telling about this practice is how difficult it actually is to achieve reliably, and how much deliberate training it takes to catch the mind in the act. If recognizing you're dreaming from the inside were easy, if waking and dreaming carried some automatic, self-evident marker distinguishing them, an entire structured discipline built around learning to notice the difference simply wouldn't need to exist. The fact that it does, and that even experienced practitioners describe missing the signs constantly, is itself a quiet piece of evidence for exactly what Descartes was arguing. There is no built-in alarm bell. Noticing you're dreaming is a skill, painstakingly acquired, not a default feature of having the experience. This is the trapdoor Descartes has built, and once you've fallen through it, an enormous amount of what you thought you knew about the external world becomes suspended in uncertainty. Not disproven, suspended. You don't know that you're dreaming, but you also can't prove that you're not, using only the resources available to you inside the experience itself. And here's the detail that makes Descartes far more careful and far more interesting than people give him credit for. Even inside the dream hypothesis, he notices something that survives. Even if the specific scene in front of you, this particular room, this particular device, these particular hands, might be a dream fabrication, certain more general features seem harder to doubt. Whether you're awake or dreaming, if you see something that looks like a shape, it seems to have some kind of extension, some kind of size. If you're doing arithmetic in a dream, 2 plus 3 still seems to equal 5. General facts about shape, quantity, and number seem to hold up whether you're asleep or awake in a way that specific facts about this is a table or this is my hand do not. For a moment, this looks like a place to rest. Maybe you can't be certain about the details of the external world, but surely mathematics is safe. Surely 2 plus 3 equals 5 no matter what state you're in. This is exactly the moment where Descartes decides not to rest and pushes his own experiment one level deeper because he realizes that even this refuge might not be as safe as it looks, and to test it he reaches for the most extreme hypothesis his mind can construct. What if, he asks, there is not merely the ordinary unreliability of dreams and senses but something far more deliberate at work? What if there existed a being of immense power, whose entire purpose was to deceive you completely, systematically, about everything? Not a passive gap in your perception, but an active, intelligent force bending every one of your experiences toward falsehood. This being, Descartes proposes, could make the sky appear blue when it is nothing of the sort. It could make the earth, air, colors, shapes, sounds, and all external things appear to exist when, in fact, none of them do. It could make you believe you have a body, hands, eyes, flesh, blood, senses, while none of that is actually true. And crucially, it could do all of this while giving you no internal sign whatsoever that anything is wrong. From the inside, a perfectly deceived mind and an undeceived mind would feel identical. Notice how deliberately extreme this hypothesis is designed to be, and why that extremity is the entire point. Descartes doesn't reach for a merely powerful deceiver, a skilled illusionist, a talented liar, a clever hacker manipulating a few inputs here and there. He reaches for the absolute maximum, a being of supreme power and supreme cunning, with no limitation on its ability to fabricate experience and no competing motive except deception itself. Why go this far? Because the entire value of the experiment depends on it. If Descartes tested his beliefs against a merely clever deceiver, he would only prove that his beliefs survive clever deception, which tells him nothing about whether they'd survive a deception he simply hasn't imagined yet, one step more sophisticated than whatever he tested against. The only way to get a truly final answer is to test against the worst conceivable case, the deception with no ceiling on its power, so that no future, more advanced deceiver could ever, even in principle, do worse. It's the same logic an engineer uses when stress testing material against forces far beyond anything it will ever actually encounter, not because that exact force is expected, but because surviving the extreme case is the only way to be sure about every lesser case at once. This is Descartes' evil demon, sometimes translated as an evil genius, a malicious spirit of supreme power and cunning, dedicating all its energy to deceiving him. And it's crucial to understand what this device is actually for, because people sometimes hear about the evil demon and think Descartes seriously believed some kind of demon might be manipulating him. He didn't. He explicitly says he's not asserting that such a being exists. He's constructing the strongest possible adversarial hypothesis he can imagine, specifically so that if he can find a belief that survives even the worst-case scenario of total, competent, intentional deception, he'll know that belief is genuinely, permanently secure. It's the philosophical equivalent of stress testing a bridge not against ordinary traffic, but against the worst load it could conceivably ever bear. If it holds under that, you know it holds. And under this hypothesis, watch how much collapses. Your senses, obviously already shaky from the dream argument, are now potentially just a demon-generated illusion, feeding you fabricated colors and shapes and sounds. Your body, is it even there? Under the demon hypothesis, you can't be sure. Even the room around you, even the idea of room and around as spatial concepts, could in principle be manipulated. But here's where it gets genuinely vertiginous, the part of Descartes' argument that goes further than most people expect. Even mathematics is not obviously safe anymore. A moment ago, 2 plus 3 equaling 5 seemed like the last stable thing in the universe. But Descartes asks, what if the demon is so powerful that it deceives me even when I add 2 and 3? What if every single time I perform that calculation, I am being made to believe the answer is 5 when in some deeper sense it is not? It sounds almost absurd to say out loud, of course 2 plus 3 is 5, but notice that of course is exactly the kind of unexamined confidence Descartes set out to interrogate in the first place. If a being of unlimited power and cunning wanted to deceive you about arithmetic itself, and gave you no way to detect the deception, would you know? The felt certainty of 2 plus 3 is 5 would be indistinguishable from a demon-implanted false certainty. And if that's true, then even the discipline that looked like humanity's most secure form of knowledge is not immune to the doubt. It's worth slowing down on the mathematics point specifically because it tends to be the moment where people's intuitive resistance to the whole exercise peaks. Surely, whatever else is in doubt, 2 plus 3 equals 5 is safe. Push on why it feels safe, though, and notice that the feeling of mathematical certainty is still, at bottom, a feeling, a specific mental experience of things clicking into place, of a conclusion following inevitably from premises, of being unable to conceive how it could be otherwise. Descartes' point is not that mathematics is probably false. It's that the feeling of I cannot conceive how this could be false is exactly the kind of internal signal a maximally powerful deceiver could, in principle, manufacture directly, without going through any external senses at all. The demon wouldn't need to trick your eyes into misreading a chalkboard. It could, hypothetically, intervene at the level of the reasoning process itself, making an invalid inference feel valid, making 2 plus 3 feel like 5 when it isn't, with no internal glitch, no seam, nothing that reasoning could use to catch the error, because the very faculty you'd use to catch it is the faculty allegedly being tampered with. This is what makes the demon hypothesis categorically more severe than ordinary sensory doubt. Sensory doubt only threatens beliefs that come in through the senses. The demon, taken to its logical extreme, threatens the reliability of thought itself, which is a far more totalizing kind of doubt than anything the bent stick or the dream ever managed to produce on their own. There's a specific, almost paradoxical feature of the demon hypothesis worth lingering on before we go further, because it explains why this scenario is so much more powerful than the dream argument alone. When you doubted whether you were dreaming, there was still, in principle, a real waking world out there somewhere that the dream might eventually give way to. The dream was a temporary detour from something more solid. The demon hypothesis removes even that comfort. Under total deception by a being of unlimited power, there might be no waking world waiting on the other side at all. It isn't you might currently be in a dream, but reality is still out there. It's the very category of an external, physical reality might itself be a fabrication, with nothing behind the curtain except the deceiver and you. That's a different, and much colder, kind of doubt. The dream argument questions a particular state you're in. The demon hypothesis questions whether the entire framework of a world exists outside my mind is warranted at all. And it's worth noticing what this hypothesis does to your sense of your own body specifically, because it's easy to skip past. You've spent your entire life assuming a fairly basic fact that you have a body, that it's located somewhere, that its boundaries mark where you stop and the world begins. Under the demon hypothesis, even this dissolves. Descartes explicitly considers the possibility that he has no hands, no eyes, no flesh, no blood, no senses at all, and yet falsely believes he possesses all of these, which means that the version of you doing the doubting right now cannot, at this stage of the argument, be assumed to be a physical thing occupying space at all. It might be, but it hasn't been proven, and under total doubt, unproven means unusable as a foundation. At this point in the experiment, almost nothing is left standing. The external world suspended, your own body suspended, memory suspended, because even your memory of what happened 5 minutes ago could be a fabrication inserted this instant. Mathematics suspended. This is deliberately the darkest point of the whole undertaking, and Descartes describes the experience of getting here not as a triumphant intellectual exercise but as something closer to drowning, as though he has fallen, quite unexpectedly, into a deep whirlpool, tumbled around so violently that he can neither stand on the bottom nor swim to the surface. It's worth sitting with that image for a second because it tells you something important. This wasn't a comfortable exercise for the man performing it. Total doubt is not a fun place to be. It's disorienting, even frightening, to strip away every foothold you've ever had, one at a time, and find that none of them survives contact with a sufficiently determined skeptical hypothesis. It's worth knowing, briefly, that Descartes wasn't the first person in history to notice that certainty is harder to come by than it feels. Long before him, ancient skeptical philosophers had already built entire schools of thought around exactly this kind of doubt. Thinkers in the Greek skeptical tradition catalogue dozens of ways in which perception varies and contradicts itself from one observer, one condition, one species even, to the next, arguing that because our senses give inconsistent reports depending on circumstance, we should suspend judgment about how things really are rather than trust any particular appearance as the truth. What makes Descartes' version different, and arguably far more radical, is where he takes the doubt and what he's trying to get out of it. The ancient skeptics generally used their doubt to recommend a kind of settled peace. Stop straining after certainty you'll never get, and you'll stop suffering over unanswerable questions. Descartes uses the same tool for the opposite purpose, not to settle into permanent doubt but to excavate through it, layer after layer, specifically searching for the one thing doubt cannot touch, so that certainty, once found however narrow, could become the cornerstone of an entirely new and more rigorous approach to knowledge. He borrows the ancient skeptics' method and points it toward a conclusion the ancient skeptics never sought. So what happens next is not just an argumentative move, it's a rescue. Somewhere inside this total collapse, Descartes notices something strange. However far the deception goes, however powerful, however total, however committed the demon is to making him believe false things about the sky, his body, the room, even arithmetic, there is one fact the demon cannot touch because the demon's entire method depends on it. To deceive someone, there has to be a someone there to deceive. Think about what deception actually requires. It requires a target, a mind that receives the false impression, that experiences the illusion, that is, in some sense, present to be fooled. The demon can make you believe the sky is green when it's not. It can make you believe you have hands when you don't. It can make you doubt arithmetic. But it cannot make you not exist while it is doing all of this to you, because the you being deceived is the very thing the deception is happening to. If there is no thinking subject there at all, there is nothing for the demon to deceive, and the whole scenario falls apart. The demon's power, however total, presupposes exactly one thing it cannot undermine, that something is there, thinking, doubting, being fooled. This is the moment Descartes describes almost as a discovery rather than a conclusion, something he stumbles onto rather than something he engineers. Let the demon deceive me as much as he possibly can, Descartes reasons, he will never bring it about that I am nothing so long as I am thinking that I am something. So, after weighing everything very carefully, this one conclusion must stand firm. The statement I exist is necessarily true every single time I express it or conceive it in my mind. Notice the strange logical shape of this discovery, because it isn't quite like proving a normal fact. Most things you prove about something external to the act of proving. You prove a bridge can bear weight, or that a chemical reacts a certain way, and the proof and the fact are separate from each other. The Cogito doesn't work like that. It isn't a fact Descartes deduces about something outside himself, it's a fact that becomes true in the very act of being considered. The instant you try to doubt that you exist, you are thinking, and the instant you are thinking, you exist, which means the doubt itself manufactures the proof it was trying to undermine. You cannot construct a scenario, however powerful the deceiver, in which the act of doubting your own existence succeeds in proving your non-existence, because the doubting is itself existence in action. This is why philosophers have sometimes called it self-verifying. Unlike almost any other belief you hold, it cannot be false at the moment it's being entertained. Every other belief you have about the room, your hands, the last 5 minutes, could, at least conceivably, be false while you believe it. This one can't. The moment of belief and the fact believed collapse into the same event. This is the famous phrase, usually rendered as cogito, ergo sum, I think, therefore I am, though in the actual text where Descartes does his deepest excavation, he arrives at it less as a syllogism and more as an immediate, undeniable recognition. The very act of doubting is itself an act of thinking, and thinking cannot occur without a thinker to do it. You can doubt the room. You can doubt your hands. You can even, in this strange thought experiment, doubt mathematics. But the doubting itself is happening, and for it to be happening, something has to exist that is doing it. Even if every single content of your thought is false, every image, every belief, every calculation a demon-fed lie, the bare fact that thinking is occurring proves that a thinker exists to do the thinking. You cannot doubt that you are doubting without, in that very act, confirming that a doubter exists. It's worth noticing how narrow and how precise this discovery actually is, because it's easy to let it expand in your mind into something much bigger than it is, and Descartes himself is careful not to let that happen too quickly. Notice what has not been proven. It has not been proven that your body exists. It has not been proven that the room exists, or your hands, or the device you're watching this on, or the person you talked to yesterday. It hasn't even been proven that the you doing the thinking is the same continuous self you were yesterday, with the same memories, the same history, the same identity persisting through time. What have been proven, with total certainty, immune even to the evil demon, is something much thinner, that thinking is occurring, and therefore a thinking thing exists right now, in this instant, doing the thinking. That's it. That's the flaw. After demolishing an entire house down to bare earth, Descartes has found 1 square foot of solid ground, not the house, not even the foundation of the house, just a single, undeniable point on which nothing else has yet been built. There's a question worth asking here that Descartes himself wrestles with in the pages immediately following the discovery, and it's a sharper question than it first appears. What, exactly, is the I that has just been proven to exist? It's tempting to hear I think, therefore I am, and quietly smuggle back in everything you already believed about yourself, your name, your history, your face, the continuous person who woke up this morning and will go to sleep tonight. But none of that has actually been secured yet. What's been proven is only that a thinking thing exists at the moment it is thinking. It hasn't been proven that this thinking thing is the same entity that existed 5 minutes ago, or that it will exist 5 minutes from now. Each successive act of thought, strictly speaking, only guarantees a thinker at the instant of that thought. The rich, continuous, biographical self you take yourself to be, the one with a childhood, a personality, a story, is a much larger and much less certain claim than the bare, momentary fact the Cogito actually delivers. Descartes himself, in the sentences that follow, has to go looking further to establish what kind of thing this I is, eventually arriving at the idea that he is, at minimum, a thinking thing, a mind, a substance whose whole nature consists in thinking, even though whether that thinking thing has any lasting identity across time, independent of memory itself being reliable, is a separate and much harder question that the Cogito alone doesn't answer. It's worth actually feeling the size of that gap rather than nodding past it, because it's larger than it first sounds. You are, right now, absolutely certain that thinking is happening. Are you equally certain that the you reading this sentence is the identical entity that woke up this morning, rather than, say, a newly arisen thinker who has simply inherited a set of memories indistinguishable from having lived through yesterday? Notice that you cannot answer this by consulting memory, because memory is exactly the thing in question. A perfectly convincing false memory of yesterday would feel, from the inside, no different from an accurate one. For precisely the same reason, a perfectly convincing dream feels no different from waking life. The Cogito gives you a guaranteed thinker in this instant. It does not, on its own, give you a guaranteed continuous person persisting from one instant to the next. Descartes needed the rest of his argument, the reasoning about God, about a non-deceiving creator sustaining him moment to moment, specifically to try to close this gap, which tells you how seriously he took it. He didn't think the momentary self was obviously the same as the lasting self either. He knew that was a further claim requiring further proof, and it's a claim that, like the external world itself, has never been secured with anything close to the certainty of the bare Cogito. There's a second gap worth noticing too, one that tends to get overlooked in casual retellings. Proving that your own mind exists does nothing on its own to prove that any other mind exists. Descartes can be certain, in this moment, that he is thinking. He cannot, from that fact alone, be certain that the people around him, his friends, his family, the person who spoke to him yesterday, are actually conscious, thinking beings rather than something that merely behaves as if they were. This is what philosophers later called the problem of other minds, and it's a direct descendant of exactly the move Descartes just made. You have direct, unmediated access to the fact that you are thinking. You have no equivalent direct access to anyone else's inner life. You only ever see behavior, hear words, watch expressions, and infer reasonably, almost certainly correctly, but still by inference rather than by the same immediate certainty the Cogito provides that something is happening inside them too. The Cogito secures exactly one mind with total certainty, the one having the thought. Every other mind in the universe, including the ones you love most, remains technically in the same uncertain category as the external world itself. This particular gap, oddly, is the one that has aged into the most unsettling modern relevance of all. You have very likely, at this point, had a conversation with something that talks fluently, responds coherently, seems to understand what you mean, perhaps even seems to express something like warmth or humor or concern, an AI system trained to produce exactly the kind of language a thinking mind would produce. And the honest philosophical position, uncomfortable as it is to say out loud, is that you are in no better position to prove that system is or isn't having any inner experience than you are to prove it about the stranger sitting across from you on a train, or for that matter, than Descartes was in 1641 trying to determine whether the hats and coats moving past his window belonged to automatons or to actual thinking people. He raises exactly this worry himself, watching figures pass by outside and noting that, strictly by what his eyes report, he cannot be certain they aren't cleverly constructed machines rather than fellow minds. He simply judges by custom and by reasonable inference that they are people. The problem of other minds was never solved by Descartes, and it has not been solved since. It has only picked up new, more urgent test cases, moving from coats and hats glimpsed through a 17th century window to conversational systems fluent enough in the 21st century to make the ancient question feel newly, uncomfortably alive. But notice what this does, dramatically speaking, in the architecture of the whole story. It changes the entire register of the piece. For 2 acts, everything has been collapsing. Now, for the first time, something holds. And it should feel like relief, genuine relief, the kind you feel when you've been falling and suddenly your hand closes around something solid. That relief is real, and it's important because it's the emotional core the rest of the argument depends on. Descartes has shown that total, universal doubt is not, in fact, total. There is one thing it cannot reach. Radical skepticism, pushed as far as it can possibly go, still leaves one ember burning. So problem solved. Reality is rescued? Not quite. And this is where the story needs to slow down rather than rush toward a triumphant ending, because the honest, careful version of this story is the one where the apparent victory turns out to be much smaller than it first appears. There's a broader question hovering underneath everything Descartes is doing that's worth naming directly, because it's the question the whole discipline of epistemology eventually organized itself around: what actually counts as knowledge as opposed to mere belief. For most of history, a natural-sounding answer was something like, knowledge is belief that's true, and that you have good reason to hold. You believe it, it happens to be correct, and you didn't just guess, you have justification. That sounds reasonable enough until you notice how easily it can come apart. Imagine believing something for a genuinely good reason, and that belief happening to be true, but only true by a kind of accident unrelated to the reason you believed it. A stopped clock that happens to show the correct time twice a day gives you a justified true belief about the hour if you glance at it during one of those moments, but nobody would say you actually knew what time it was. You got lucky. Cases like this, developed by philosophers long after Descartes, show that even justified true belief isn't quite a complete definition of knowledge. There's some further ingredient, still debated today, that separates genuine knowing from merely believing something true for reasons that happen to work out. Descartes was chasing something even stricter than this. Entire debate assumes not just justified true belief immune to lucky accidents, but belief that could not possibly have turned out false given the reasons for holding it, a standard so severe that, as you've now seen firsthand, almost nothing external to your own thinking survives contact with it. There's a related, quieter question worth sitting with too. Can experience validate itself? Can the mere fact that something feels certain ever, on its own, count as proof that it's true? This sounds almost too simple, but it's exactly the trap the whole dream argument and demon hypothesis were built to expose. Every single belief you've ever held with total conviction, including false ones you later abandoned, felt, at the time, exactly as certain as your true beliefs feel now. The feeling of certainty, from the inside, does not come stamped with a reliability rating. It feels the same whether it's tracking something real or something entirely constructed. This means experience cannot be its own witness. Something outside the mere feeling of conviction has to do the work of separating justified confidence from unjustified confidence, and finding that something outside turns out to be one of the hardest problems in the whole discipline, arguably the same problem Descartes spent the rest of his life and philosophy has spent the centuries since trying and failing to fully close. Before going further, it's worth being honest about how tempting it is to stop the story right here and call it a happy ending. You demolished everything, you found one indestructible point, cue triumphant music, roll credits. That version of the story would be satisfying, and it would also be a lie, because it would flatten one of the most important distinctions in the entire text: the difference between finding a foundation and finishing a building. Descartes himself is explicit that he has not yet rebuilt anything. He has found bedrock. He has not yet placed a single additional brick on top of it. And the honest next question, the one a careful thinker has to ask instead of celebrating too early, is whether bedrock this narrow can actually support anything larger than itself. Ask yourself exactly what I think, therefore I am has actually given you. It has given you certainty that a thinking thing exists right now while it's thinking. It has not given you certainty that this thinking thing has a body. It has not given you certainty that the external world, chairs, walls, other people, the device in your hands, exists outside your mind at all. It has not given you certainty that your memories of 5 minutes ago or 5 years ago are accurate or even real, rather than fabricated impressions with no corresponding past. Descartes has proven the existence of a mind. He has not yet proven the existence of anything that mind perceives. This is historically exactly the problem Descartes spends the rest of the meditations trying to solve, and it's worth being honest about how difficult and how contested his solution actually is, rather than pretending the video's job is done at the Cogito. Descartes' own strategy from here involves examining the contents of his mind for an idea of a perfect, infinite being, God, and arguing that the very fact he, an imperfect and finite thinker, possesses the idea of infinite perfection requires an explanation that only an actually existing infinite being could provide. From there, he argues that a perfect God would not be a deceiver, and therefore, if he uses his faculties of reason and perception carefully, he can trust that the external world, in general, really does exist more or less as he perceives it, even if particular perceptions can still mislead him at the edges, the way the bent stick did. It's worth being straightforward with you here. This part of Descartes' argument is the part that later philosophers have found the least convincing, and it's important not to oversell it. Many of his contemporaries and successors pointed out what's come to be called the Cartesian circle, the worry that Descartes uses reason to prove God exists, and then uses God's existence to guarantee that his reasoning is trustworthy, which looks uncomfortably like using a tool to certify itself. Others simply weren't persuaded that an idea of perfection in the mind requires a perfect being to produce it. The theological bridge Descartes builds to get from I exist as a thinking thing back to the external world exists and is roughly as I perceive it is the shakiest part of the entire structure, and honest philosophy has to say so rather than pretend the problem was cleanly solved in 1641 and everyone went home satisfied. There's a further wrinkle worth sitting with because it's the kind of detail that separates a genuinely careful account of Descartes from a simplified one. Even setting aside whether the proof of God's existence succeeds, look at what work it's actually being asked to do. Descartes wants to move from I have an idea of a perfect being to a perfect being exists to a perfect being would not allow me to be systematically deceived about the world to, finally, therefore, the external world I perceive is generally trustworthy. That's 4 separate steps, each one carrying real philosophical weight, and if any single link in that chain fails, the whole bridge back to the external world collapses with it, while the Cogito, sitting at the start of the chain, remains completely untouched. This asymmetry matters enormously for understanding the actual shape of the argument. The doubt is airtight and nearly universally accepted even by Descartes' harshest critics. The recovery is contested, has been contested since the year the Meditations was published, and remains contested today. You are not exaggerating or being needlessly cynical by noticing that the demolition succeeded far more completely than the rebuilding did. That asymmetry is simply what's there in the text, and philosophers far more sympathetic to Descartes than any skeptic have said the same thing. Which means the deeper, more honest way to end this act is not and then Descartes proved the world was real again, but something more unsettling and frankly more interesting, the problem of the external world, the gap between what your mind directly experiences and what actually exists independently of your mind, if anything does, was never fully closed. Descartes opened a door that philosophy has never quite managed to shut again. Even philosophers deeply unconvinced by his theological solution generally agree that the challenge itself, how do you get from the certainty of your own thinking to certainty about anything outside your thinking, is real, sharp, and still not resolved with anything like the certainty Descartes was chasing. There's a natural objection worth voicing directly, because if you've been following along, some part of you has probably already been forming it. Does any of this actually matter? You've gone your entire life without a philosophical proof of the external world, and it hasn't stopped you from crossing streets safely, trusting bridges, loving people, building an entire functioning existence on top of beliefs that, strictly speaking, were never philosophically certified. Doesn't ordinary life simply work, regardless of whether the deepest metaphysical question underneath it ever gets answered? This objection deserves to be taken seriously rather than waved away because, in one sense, it's completely correct. Practically speaking, radical doubt changes nothing about how you should act. If you doubt the floor exists with philosophical rigor but still step on it the same way you always have, nothing bad happens, and nothing about your daily functioning depends on resolving the question philosophically. Descartes knew this too. He explicitly warns in his own writing against actually trying to live by radical doubt outside the confines of the thought experiment, comparing it to a temporary retreat from ordinary belief rather than a permanent way of navigating the world. So if the question is, does this change what I should do tomorrow morning? The honest answer is probably not very much. Think about what this looks like in the most important relationships you have, because it's a better test case than any abstract example. You cannot prove with the certainty Descartes was chasing that the people you love are conscious rather than elaborate biological machinery producing love-shaped behavior with nothing felt behind it. You cannot prove that your memory of the specific moment you fell in love with someone or the specific afternoon of friendship deepened into something more durable is an accurate record rather than a reconstruction assembled after the fact and quietly edited every time you recall it. And yet none of that uncertainty has ever, for a single day, stopped anyone from loving another person completely, building a life around them, trusting them with everything that matters. That's not naivety. It's not a failure to think the problem through. It's a recognition, mostly unconscious but completely correct, that the kind of certainty required for love, trust, and commitment was never the demon-proof kind in the first place, and demanding it would be demanding the wrong thing from the wrong domain entirely. Descartes' method was built for one very specific job, locating the absolute floor of knowledge, and it would be a misuse of that method to drag its impossibly strict standard into parts of life that were never built to meet it and don't need to. There's a still deeper version of the objection worth taking seriously before moving on, because some philosophers have pushed it further than doubt doesn't change my behavior. They've asked whether certainty of the absolute kind Descartes was hunting is even a coherent standard to hold knowledge to in the first place. If no belief about the external world could ever, even in principle, meet that standard, maybe the standard itself is the flawed part of the equation, not the beliefs. A goalpost nobody could ever reach, this argument goes, isn't a meaningful measure of anything, it's just a trivially true observation dressed up as a discovery. Under this view, insisting on absolute certainty before you'll call something known is a bit like insisting a marathon runner hasn't really finished the race unless they've also crossed every other marathon course on Earth simultaneously, technically a higher bar, but not obviously a more meaningful one. This is a serious objection, and it's one of the main reasons later epistemology largely moved away from certainty as the central requirement for knowledge, replacing it with the more workable standards mentioned earlier: justification, reliability, warrant. But it's worth noticing what this objection concedes. Even as it argues against Descartes, it doesn't claim the gap he found isn't real. It claims the gap might not matter as much as Descartes thought it did. That's a genuinely different and more modest criticism than saying his argument was simply wrong. Even philosophers who think Descartes was chasing an unreasonable standard still generally agree that the standard, once articulated, cannot be met. They've just concluded that this says more about the standard than it does about the beliefs being measured against it. Which leaves you exactly where the video have been leaving you all along, from a slightly different angle. The world you experience may be perfectly real, overwhelmingly likely to be real, reasonable in every practical sense to believe in, and still formally unproven in the strict sense Descartes was after. Whether that unprovability should bother you, or whether it's simply the wrong thing to have ever wanted, is itself part of what's still being argued about 400 years later. But that's a narrower question than the one actually being asked, and collapsing the two is where the objection quietly loses its force. The value of the exercise was never about generating new instructions for how to live. It was about examining what knowledge actually is, what it would take for a belief to count, not just as useful, not just as reliable enough to build a life on, but as genuinely known, in the strictest sense of the word. And that turns out to be a much rarer and stranger category than most people assume before they've done the exercise. You can live an entire life on excellent, well-justified, overwhelmingly reliable beliefs without a single one of them meeting the standard of absolute certainty, and most people do exactly that without ever noticing the gap, because the gap doesn't interfere with anything practical. Descartes' contribution wasn't to close that gap. It was to make it visible, precisely, for the first time, and to show exactly where its edges are. It's worth knowing what happened to this question after Descartes set it loose, because the story doesn't end with him, and the honest version of this video owes you at least a glimpse of where it went. Later philosophers, writing in the empiricist tradition, pushed back hard against Descartes' confidence that reason alone, without leaning on experience, could ever rebuild knowledge of the external world, arguing instead that all of our ideas ultimately trace back to sensory experience, and that grand rationalist proofs like the ones Descartes attempted were far shakier than they appeared. One of these philosophers, writing decades later, took the empiricist critique to its most unsettling possible conclusion: if all we ever really have access to are our own impressions and ideas, we cannot even be fully certain that cause and effect, one of the most basic structures we use to make sense of the world, is anything more than a habit of expectation built from repeated experience rather than a necessary feature of reality itself. In other words, Descartes' demolition of certainty turned out to have a demolition of its own waiting further down the road, aimed this time not just at the external world, but at the very logical glue, cause, effect, necessity that Descartes had taken for granted while trying to rebuild. It was against this even deeper skeptical challenge that another major philosopher, writing later in the 18th century, proposed one of the most influential responses in the entire history of the problem. Instead of asking whether we can prove the external world matches our experience of it, perhaps the better question is to accept that human minds can never access things as they are in themselves, independent of the mind's own structuring activity, and can only ever know things as they appear, already shaped by the mind's built-in categories of space-time and causality. Under this view, Descartes' whole project was aimed at an unreachable target from the start, not because the external world doesn't exist, but because the question "what is it like?", entirely independent of any mind perceiving it, may not even be a question minds are equipped to answer, in the same way a fish might never be able to describe water from outside of being wet. This doesn't resolve Descartes' doubt so much as reframe it, suggesting that the gap he discovered between mind and world isn't a temporary problem waiting for a clever enough proof, but possibly a permanent structural feature of what it means to be a mind at all. None of these later responses definitively settle the question either. Philosophy, 4 centuries on, still doesn't have a universally accepted answer to what Descartes started, and that's not a failure of the discipline so much as an honest reflection of how hard the question actually is. But it's worth knowing that you're not standing at the end of this story. You're standing somewhere in the middle of a conversation that has been running continuously since 1641, picked up and extended by nearly every major philosopher who came after him, none of whom found a way to make the problem simply disappear. It's worth knowing, too, that this same act of demolition and rebuilding didn't only echo forward into later philosophy, it helped shape the entire way modern science came to justify itself. Descartes was writing at almost exactly the moment the scientific revolution was gathering force, and his insistence on starting from doubt, discarding inherited authority, and accepting nothing without independent verification became one of the intellectual templates for how the emerging scientific method would justify its own break from centuries of unquestioned tradition. You can see the same basic move in the foundations of experimental science. Don't trust a claim because an ancient authority said so. Test it, verify it, build knowledge from the ground up on evidence that survives scrutiny rather than opinion that merely feels settled. Descartes himself worked directly in this territory, contributing significant work in mathematics and optics alongside his philosophy, and treating the demolition of unjustified belief not as an end in itself but as necessary groundwork for a more reliable science of nature. The habit of mind he modeled in the meditations refused to accept anything without examining its foundation first became, in a sense, one of the quiet philosophical ancestors of the peer-reviewed, evidence-demanding culture of modern science, even in the many places where that culture has since moved well beyond anything Descartes himself would recognize or endorse. And this is exactly why, nearly 4 centuries later, his argument doesn't feel like a dusty relic of early modern philosophy. It feels current. It feels, in fact, more urgent now than it did in his own century, because the 20th and 21st centuries have handed us technologies that make his thought experiments feel less like abstractions and more like blueprints. Consider the version philosophers in the 20th century built directly on top of Descartes' scaffolding instead of an evil demon whispering falsehoods into an immaterial mind. Imagine a brain removed from its body, suspended in a vat of nutrient fluid, kept alive artificially, with its nerve endings wired into a supercomputer that feeds it electrical signals precisely matched to simulate an entire ordinary life. Every sensation you've ever had, the weight of your body, the taste of food, the sound of a voice you love, could, in principle, be produced this way with no external world at all corresponding to any of it. The brain in the vat has no way, from the inside, of distinguishing its wide, simulated existence from an unplugged, ordinary one, for exactly the same reason the dreamer inside the dream has no way of knowing they're dreaming, and for exactly the same reason a mind facing Descartes' demon has no internal marker separating deception from reality. Swap the demon for a machine, and the argument's logical bones are unchanged. This isn't Descartes' own idea, it's a later development built explicitly on his foundation, but the resemblance is not a coincidence. It's the same trapdoor rebuilt with 20th century materials. There's a more grounded, less speculative version of this same erosion happening right now, one you've almost certainly already run into without framing it in Cartesian terms. Footage exists today, video, not just still images of people saying and doing things they never said or did, generated convincingly enough that ordinary viewers watching without suspicion cannot reliably tell the difference from genuine footage. A voice can now be cloned from a short sample and made to say anything in the speaker's own cadence, their own particular way of pausing before a certain word. None of this requires an evil demon or a brain in a vat. It requires a laptop and freely available software. And once you know this is possible, once you've internalized that the video evidence you used to treat as close to unimpeachable proof, I saw it with my own eyes, I heard it with my own ears, is now something a determined and moderately resourced person can fabricate convincingly, something shifts in how you have to relate to your own senses even in ordinary, non-philosophical contexts. Descartes had to invent a supernatural being to get you to doubt the reliability of your own eyes and ears. Increasingly, you don't need the invention. You just need to remember what you already know is technically possible. Push it one step further and you arrive at an idea that has become almost mainstream in contemporary philosophy of mind and, oddly, in Silicon Valley conversation, the simulation argument, the suggestion that any sufficiently advanced civilization would likely be able to run enormous numbers of detailed, conscious simulations of minds like yours, and that if such simulations are possible and numerous, an observer in a random position, you, for instance, is statistically more likely to be inside one of the simulated experiences than the single original, unsimulated reality. Again, this is not something Descartes proposed, and it's important to be careful not to blur historical lines here, but the philosophical shape underneath it is his. Replace evil demon with simulation, and the core question is identical. What, in your present experience, could possibly distinguish a perfectly simulated world from a real one? What internal feature of this exact moment, the texture of the couch, the light in the room, the weight of your own thoughts could serve as proof that you are not, right now, a simulated mind experiencing a simulated version of exactly this? There's an even more immediate, less exotic version of this same idea that doesn't require a supercomputer or a hypothetical future civilization at all. It only requires a headset you can already buy today. Virtual reality technology, imperfect as it currently is, works on exactly the principle Descartes' demon hypothesis describes in miniature. Feed a mind convincing sensory signals, and the mind will construct a convincing world around them, largely indifferent to whether anything physical actually corresponds to what it's perceiving. People using sufficiently immersive VR systems report genuine vertigo standing at a simulated ledge that isn't really there, genuine flinching from a simulated object hurtling toward their face, genuine physiological fear responses to threats that have no physical existence whatsoever. Their bodies react to the simulation as though it were real, because from the perspective of the nervous system processing the incoming signal, the distinction between real ledge and simulated ledge isn't something raw sensory processing can settle on its own. It takes conscious, effortful reasoning layered on top of the raw experience to remember, no, actually, I am standing in my living room. Descartes' demon needed supernatural power to achieve this effect on a mind in the 17th century. Consumer electronics can produce a rough, still improving version of the same trick today, and every year the resolution, the field of view, the haptic feedback, and the sense of presence get measurably closer to seamless. You don't even need science fiction to feel the pull of this question anymore. You've likely already seen, this year, images generated by artificial intelligence that are close to indistinguishable from photographs, faces that never existed, rendered with pores and asymmetries and the small imperfections that used to be the telltale signs of something real. Voices cloned convincingly enough to fool people who know the speaker well. Entire synthetic environments rendered in real time, detailed enough to momentarily disorient the eye. None of this proves that your current experience is artificial, but it does something quietly important. It collapses the intuitive gap between obviously real and obviously fake that most people, without ever examining it, use as their working definition of reality. A generation ago, if it looks and sounds completely convincing, it's probably real was a reasonably safe heuristic. It is becoming, year by year, a much less safe one, not because the world has become less real, but because the tools for producing convincing unreality have become extraordinary. Descartes had to imagine a demon of supernatural power to construct his worst-case scenario. You are living in a decade where something functionally similar is being built piece by piece in ordinary research labs without any supernatural assistance required. It's worth being precise about what this actually proves and what it doesn't, because it would be easy to overstate the connection between AI-generated content and Descartes' demon in a way that isn't quite fair to either. The existence of convincing synthetic images doesn't prove that any specific thing you're currently experiencing is fake. That would be a leap the evidence doesn't support. What it proves is something more structural, that the gap between feels completely real and is actually real is not a fixed permanent gap that human intuition can be trusted to track accurately forever. That gap moves. It had been moving measurably within a single human generation. A test that would have reliably separated real from fake a decade ago. Resolution, consistency of lighting, the physics of how hair or fabric moves increasingly fails to do so. Descartes constructed his demon as a maximally powerful, purely hypothetical adversary, useful precisely because no real deceiver could ever be that good. The unsettling modern update isn't that any real technology has become as powerful as an omnipotent demon. It's that the distance between hypothetical philosophical worst case and engineering roadmap have been shrinking in a way nobody in the 17th century, or even the 20th, would have predicted. There's also a quieter, less dramatic version of this same problem that doesn't require demons, simulations, or artificial intelligence at all. It just requires neuroscience. What you experience as the room around you is not actually the room itself entering your mind directly. It's a reconstruction assembled by your brain from patterns of light hitting your retina, translated into electrical signals processed through multiple layers of interpretation, prediction, and correction before it ever becomes the seamless, effortless feeling experience you call seeing the room. Your brain doesn't passively receive reality. Contemporary cognitive science increasingly describes perception as a kind of controlled, ongoing prediction, your brain constantly guessing what's out there and adjusting its guess against incoming sensory data, so that what you experience as direct, immediate contact with the world is actually the output of an elaborate, mostly unconscious modeling process. This doesn't mean the world isn't there. But it does mean that what you're in direct contact with moment to moment is not the world itself, it's your brain's best model of the world, and models can be wrong, incomplete, or, in principle, driven by inputs that don't correspond to anything external at all. Descartes didn't have access to any of this neuroscience. But the shape of the problem he identified with a demon in 1641 is the same shape neuroscience quietly confirms about the actual architecture of perception in the 21st century. There is a gap, a real and structural gap between the world and your experience of the world, and that gap is exactly where all of this uncertainty lies. You can see this gap directly, without any special equipment, in phenomena you've probably already experienced without naming them. Optical illusions are the most obvious example. Two lines of identical length that your visual system insists are different lengths, even after you've measured them and know, with certainty, that they're equal. Knowing the truth doesn't change what you see. Your brain's model overrides the measured fact and keeps presenting the illusion as though it was simply how things are. There's also the phenomenon of change blindness, in which large, obvious differences between two nearly identical images go completely unnoticed by observers who are looking directly at the change because the brain's model of what's there is doing so much of the interpretive work that it simply fails to update in response to information that should be impossible to miss. And there's the well-documented experience among people who lose a limb of continuing to feel sensation, sometimes pain, in a hand or foot that no longer physically exists because the brain's model of the body persists even after the body itself has changed. In every one of these cases, what you experienced is demonstrably not a direct transcript of what's physically present. It's a construction, usually an excellent and useful one, but a construction nonetheless, which is precisely the vulnerability Descartes' demon was designed to exploit, expressed here not through supernatural deception but through the ordinary, well-documented mechanics of how a brain builds a world. None of this means your perception is generally wrong. For almost every practical purpose, it's remarkably accurate, tuned by evolution over an immense span of time to track the features of the environment that matter for survival. But accuracy for practical purposes and certainty in the philosophical sense Descartes was chasing are, once again, two different standards, and the existence of a real, physical, biological gap between world and experience is exactly the kind of structural vulnerability his method of doubt was built to locate. There's one more question worth asking before we come back to you, because it's the question that actually determines whether any of this matters emotionally, not just intellectually. Suppose somehow you found out with total certainty that your entire life had been a simulation, every relationship, every memory, every sunset, every conversation with someone you love, all of it generated rather than real in whatever sense you'd previously assumed. Would that discovery change the meaning those experiences had for you? This is genuinely contested, and it's worth holding both sides rather than picking one for you. One answer says yes, obviously, everything changes. If none of it was real, then none of it mattered. The love was directed at something that in some deeper sense wasn't there to receive it. The achievements were hollow. The whole story was a puppet show performed for no one. There's real intuitive force to this. Something in most people recoils at the idea that their most meaningful moments could have been, underneath the surface, nothing but signals and code. But the other answer says something quite different, and it has serious philosophical defenders. The felt reality of an experience, the actual texture of joy, grief, love, curiosity, as they occur inside a mind, doesn't obviously depend on what substrate produced it. If the joy felt like joy while it was happening, engaged your thoughts the way joy engages thoughts, shaped your choices the way joy shapes choices, then in what sense was it not real joy, merely because its ultimate cause was a simulation rather than a mediated physical reality? Under this view, discovering you were in a simulation would be a discovery about the mechanism underneath your experiences, not a discovery that the experiences themselves were fake, the same way discovering that color is really just wavelengths of light interpreted by a nervous system doesn't make the color you see any less vividly actually present to you in the moment you see it. Descartes never had to answer this particular question because the technology that makes it vivid didn't exist yet. But notice that it's a direct descendant of exactly the distinction his whole method turns on, the difference between what is metaphysically the case and what is experientially given. He proved, with total certainty, that thinking is occurring. He never got to settle what thinking is made of or what it would mean for the significance of that thinking if its underlying cause turned out to be radically different from what common sense assumes. That question, does the meaning of an experience depend on its metaphysical origin or only on how it actually felt from the inside, is still open, still argued over, and probably worth more of your time than most of what you'll watch today. So here's where we come back to you, the room, the screen, your hands, the last several minutes, everything the video began with. None of it feels any different than it did when we started. That's worth noticing because it's part of the point. The chair still feels solid. The light still looks like light. Your memory of pressing play on this video still feels like an accurate memory rather than an implanted one. Total, felt certainty has not gone anywhere. What has changed is not the feeling, it's your relationship to the feeling. You now understand, in a way you probably didn't 40 minutes ago, that the feeling of certainty and the fact of certainty are two different things, and that almost everything you believe about the world outside your own thinking rests on the first without ever having secured the second. There's a specific, easy misreading worth heading off directly because it's the misreading this kind of material attracts most often, and it does real damage when it takes hold. Radical doubt, treated as a permanent lens rather than a temporary experiment, doesn't produce wisdom. It produces a kind of corrosive paralysis, a habit of refusing to commit to anything because nothing meets an impossible standard. That is not what Descartes was demonstrating, and it's not what 4 centuries of philosophers have taken from him either. The entire discipline of epistemology that grew out of this text spent the following centuries developing far more sophisticated tools than certain and uncertain for evaluating belief, concepts like justification, reliability, warrant, probability, and evidence, which let you say coherently that a belief can be extremely well supported, rational to act on, and worth building your life around without ever claiming the kind of absolute demon-proof certainty Descartes was specifically hunting for in this one narrow experiment. Knowing that you can't prove the external world exists with the same certainty as your own thinking does not mean you have no grounds at all for believing in it. It means the grounds you have are of a different, humbler kind: inference, coherence, predictive success, the sheer practical fact that trusting the world has never once let you down in a way that trusting a hallucination would, and that humbler kind of ground is, in the end, the only kind available to any of us about almost everything we believe. This is not, despite the video's title, a proof that reality is fake. Descartes never proved that, and neither has anyone since. It would be a serious misreading of everything you've just gone through to walk away thinking nothing is real or there's no point trusting anything. That's not what methodological doubt was for. Descartes tore his beliefs down not to live in the rubble, but to find out which ones could be rebuilt with something firmer underneath them than mere habit. And practically speaking, you're going to keep trusting your senses after this video ends, the same way Descartes did after finishing his own experiment. He went back to eating dinner, writing letters, believing there was a fire in front of him when he felt warm. Radical doubt is not a permanent way to live. Even Descartes treated it as a temporary tool, not a lifestyle. The distinction that matters, the one worth carrying with you, is between practical certainty, the reasonable, working confidence that lets you function, cross the street, trust the floor, love the people in your life, and philosophical certainty, the much rarer, much stricter kind that survives every conceivable challenge without exception. You have plenty of the first. You have shockingly little of the second, and it turns out almost nobody does about almost anything outside the bare fact of their own thinking. And maybe that's actually the more interesting discovery than a simple reality is fake headline could ever deliver. Because if certainty of that absolute kind is this rare, if the only thing that has ever survived every possible skeptical assault, from ancient skeptics to Descartes' demon to modern brain inovat scenarios to simulation arguments to the quiet, unsettling facts of neuroscience, is the bare fact that thinking is happening, then maybe the right response isn't despair. Maybe it's a kind of tear-eyed humility about how much of what you call knowledge is actually well-justified confidence rather than airtight proof, and an appreciation for how strange it is that this confidence works as well as it does, even without the guarantee philosophers have spent centuries trying and failing to supply. Go back, for a moment, to your hands. Look at them the way you looked at them at the very beginning of this video before any of this started. Nothing about them has changed. The lines are the same lines. The small scar or freckle is still exactly where it was. If someone asked you right now, "Are you sure you have hands?" some part of you might still bristle a little at the question, the same way you would have 40 minutes ago. That instinctive confidence never left. What's different now is that you know something about where that confidence comes from and where it doesn't. It comes from a lifetime of consistent experience, from a brain extraordinarily well-tuned to model a stable, navigable world, from the sheer practical success of trusting your hands every single day of your life without exception. It does not come from proof. It never did. And the strange, quiet discovery sitting underneath this entire video is that it never needed to, because almost nothing you rely on to live actually rests on proof of that kind. It rests on something humbler, something that has simply never failed you badly enough to be questioned until, for exactly one video, you questioned it anyway. Here's the final, quiet twist, the one worth sitting with after everything else fades. If a perfectly convincing illusion existed, one with no internal marker distinguishing it from reality, no seam, no flicker, nothing that would give it away from the inside, it would not look like static, or glitches, or some obviously artificial texture. It would look exactly like this. It would feel exactly the way this room feels right now, exactly the way your hands feel right now, exactly the way this sentence feels as you read or hear it. The frightening possibility was never that reality might turn out to be an illusion. It's that a perfect illusion would be completely indistinguishable from the thing you're experiencing at this exact moment, which means the question Descartes asked in 1641 is not a question you can answer once and then set aside. It's a question that stays open every time you ask it, because the tools available to you, your senses, your memory, your reasoning, are the same tools you'd have to use to investigate whether those very tools can be trusted in the first place. There's something almost tender, in the end, about where Descartes actually landed once you strip away 4 centuries of demons and vats and simulations built on top of his original text. A man tried, with total seriousness, to find one thing he could know for certain, and what he found wasn't a grand fact about the universe, or a proof of God, or a guarantee about the world outside his window. What he found was smaller and, in a way, more intimate than any of that, the bare, undeniable fact that someone was there, thinking, doubting, searching. Before any question about the room, the body, the world outside, before any of that, there was simply a mind present to itself, unable to be talked out of its own existence, no matter how powerful the deceiver arrayed against it. Everything else in your life, every relationship, every memory, every plan for tomorrow sits on top of that one bare fact, whether or not you've ever noticed it was there. Descartes noticed. That's the whole discovery. Not that the world is fake, not that certainty is impossible, but that underneath every single thing you've ever doubted, there has always been exactly one thing quietly incapable of being doubted away, you thinking, right now, about all of it. So here's the question worth sitting with, the one Descartes leaves you holding at the end of his own experiment 4 centuries later, still unanswered. If you could never, even in principle, tell the difference between the realest possible reality and the most perfect possible illusion, would it actually matter which one you were in? If this video made you sit with that question even for a second, say what you'd want to know first, whether it's real, or whether it would even matter.